And I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about, because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation. And we want to help the people. It's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country.
Okay, so the White House just escalated things massively in Latin America. And we're talking about a diplomatic situation that's spinning out of control in real time. President Trump's administration just expanded its warning list to include more Latin American nations. And this isn't just some routine diplomatic message. This is the kind of move that fundamentally reshapes America's relationship with an entire hemisphere. And the implications are absolutely huge. We're talking about potential economic fallout, massive geopolitical shifts, and the very real possibility that the United States is about to find itself completely isolated in its own backyard, while China and Russia move in to fill the vacuum. And here's the thing. This is happening right as we're heading into the 2026 midterms, which means the political stakes couldn't be higher. The administration is doubling down on its hardline approach to the region, and what we're seeing is a strategy that could either reshape hemispheric relations or blow up spectacularly in Trump's face. This isn't just about foreign policy anymore. This is about immigration, trade, domestic politics, and America's standing in the world. And the consequences are going to be felt from Washington to Mexico City, from Caracas to Buenos Aires, and everywhere in between. Now, before we dive deep into what's actually happening here, let's be honest about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this. They'll give you the surface-level headline, maybe quote a State Department spokesman, and move on to the next crisis. But they won't connect the dots. They won't show you how this fits into the broader pattern of Trump's foreign policy, how it affects everyday Americans, or what the long-term consequences are going to be. That's why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and actually understand what's happening in American politics right now, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We bring you the news straight to you every single day, breaking down the complex political machinery that mainstream outlets either ignore or deliberately obscure. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part
president of action, like, I don't understand yet how they haven't figured this out. And now, if you don't know, now you know. Because this is the way it's going to play out. And I think people need to understand that this is not a president that just talks and does letters and press conferences. And, you know, if he says he's serious about something, he means it. And this is something that was a direct threat to the national interest of the United States, and the president addressed it.
of a community that truly cares about getting to the truth behind the headlines, this is your moment. Subscribe right now and drop a comment below with your thoughts on what this means for America's relationship with Latin America. We want to hear from you. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. The Trump administration, through the State Department, just issued formal warnings to multiple Latin American countries, expanding a list that already included several nations in the region. Now, the exact details of which countries received these new warnings haven't been fully disclosed yet, but sources inside the State Department are saying we're talking about at least 3 to 5 additional nations being put on notice. And these aren't minor players. We're potentially talking about countries that represent major trading partners, significant migration routes, and critical regional allies. The warnings themselves cover a range of issues, but the core message is clear. Cooperate with Trump's immigration enforcement agenda, align with U.S. positions on regional security issues, or face consequences. And those consequences could include everything from reduced foreign aid and diplomatic downgrading to potential sanctions and trade restrictions. This is the White House essentially drawing a line in the sand across an entire hemisphere and saying, you're either with us or you're against us. Now here's where this gets complicated, and where the mainstream media completely misses the story. These warnings didn't come out of nowhere. They're part of a broader pattern that's been building throughout Trump's current term. Over the past year, the administration has been systematically applying pressure to Latin American governments on multiple fronts. We've seen threats to cut humanitarian aid to countries that don't cooperate on immigration enforcement. We've seen trade negotiations being used as leverage to force compliance on border security. We've seen diplomatic relationships deteriorate with governments that Trump views as insufficiently supportive of his agenda. And we've seen the State Department being sidelined while hardliners in the White House National Security Council drive policy. What we're witnessing right now is the culmination of that approach. The administration has decided that quiet diplomacy isn't working, that carrots aren't effective, and that it's time to go full stick. The problem is that this strategy is playing out in a region that's already dealing with massive economic challenges, political instability, and growing resentment toward perceived U.S. interference. And the timing couldn't be worse. Let's talk about what's actually in these warnings, because the details matter enormously here. According to leaked communications that are circulating among diplomatic circles, the warnings focus on several key demands. First, there's immigration enforcement. The administration is demanding that countries accept deportation flights, agree to process asylum seekers on their own territory, and crack down on migration routes passing through their borders. We're talking about the kind of externalization of border enforcement that essentially turns other countries into extensions of U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. Second, there's alignment on Venezuela. The White House wants explicit support for its regime change policy, recognition of opposition leaders as legitimate government, and participation in regional isolation of Maduro's government. Third, there's China. The administration is warning countries against expanding economic ties with Beijing, particularly infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. And fourth, there's drug enforcement, with demands for increased cooperation on counter-narcotics operations and acceptance of U.S. law enforcement presence on foreign soil. These aren't requests. These are ultimatums. And the implicit threat is that failure to comply will result in a fundamental downgrade in bilateral relations. And here's the problem. Here's why this is so much bigger than it looks. Latin America in 2026 is not the same region it was during Trump's first term or even during previous Republican administrations. The political landscape has shifted dramatically. You've got left-leaning governments in major countries who are deeply skeptical of U.S. intervention and increasingly willing to align with alternative powers. You've got economies that are diversifying away from dependence on U.S. markets and finding new trading partners in Asia and Europe. You've got populations that are overwhelmingly opposed to perceived U.S. bullying and increasingly supportive of leaders who stand up to Washington. And you've got a regional integration movement that, while fractured, is capable of coordinating responses to external pressure. What Trump is doing right now is essentially betting that he can strong-arm an entire hemisphere into submission through threats and economic pressure. But the historical record on that approach is not good. In fact, every time the United States has tried to dominate Latin America through coercion rather than partnership, it's created long-term resentment, opened the door to rival powers, and ultimately undermined American interests in the region. Now, let's talk about what's happening behind the scenes, because this is where the story gets really interesting. People inside the State Department are reportedly furious about this escalation. Career diplomats who have spent decades building relationships in the region are watching those relationships implode in real time. There are reports of senior Foreign Service officers being cut out of the decision-making process entirely, with policy being driven by ideological hardliners who have little understanding of the region's complexities. One diplomat told Reuters, off the record, that this approach is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, where countries that might have been willing to cooperate are now being pushed into opposition. And it's not just the State Department. Intelligence agencies are warning that this strategy is creating openings for adversaries. The CIA has reportedly briefed the White House on how China is capitalizing on U.S. diplomatic missteps by offering no-strings-attached investment and development assistance. Russian intelligence services are actively courting governments that feel abandoned by Washington. And even European allies are expressing concern about the destabilization of a region they have significant economic interests in. But here's what makes this particularly explosive from a political standpoint. This is happening in an election year. The 2026 midterms are less than 10 months away, and Latino voters are going to be a critical constituency in multiple battleground states. The Trump administration is essentially conducting a foreign policy that directly antagonizes the home countries of millions of American citizens and residents. We're talking about communities with deep ties to Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, who are watching their countries of origin being threatened by the U.S. government. And the political calculation here is absolutely baffling. Republicans are already facing significant challenges with Latino voters. Polling consistently shows that Trump's immigration rhetoric and policies have damaged the party's standing with this demographic. And now the administration is doubling down with a foreign policy approach that's going to reinforce every negative perception about Republican attitudes toward Latin America. Democrats are already weaponizing this. You're seeing statements from Latino members of Congress calling the warnings neo-imperialist, counterproductive, and dangerous. You're seeing organizing efforts in Latino communities around the message that Trump views their ancestral homelands as subordinate territories rather than sovereign nations. And you're seeing the potential for this to become a defining issue in tight House and Senate races in states with significant Latino populations. Okay, let's break down what this actually means because there are multiple layers here that we need to unpack. First, understand that this represents a fundamental shift in how the United States engages with Latin America. For decades, regardless of which party controlled the White House, there was at least a nominal commitment to partnership, to respecting sovereignty, to working through multilateral institutions like the Organization of American States. There were obviously interventions, covert operations, support for coups, all the ugly history of U.S. involvement in the region. But the public framework was always cooperation and mutual benefit. What Trump is doing now is stripping away that pretense entirely. He's conducting foreign policy based on raw power politics, explicit threats, and the assumption that smaller, poorer countries have no choice but to submit to American demands. This isn't diplomacy. This is coercion. And the message it sends to the entire world, not just Latin America, is that the United States under Trump views international relations as purely transactional and power-based. Second, this creates massive opportunities for America's geopolitical rivals, and we're already seeing them capitalize on it. China has been expanding its presence in Latin America for years, through infrastructure investment, trade agreements, and diplomatic engagement. Beijing doesn't attach political conditions to its assistance. It doesn't demand changes in domestic policy. It doesn't threaten countries that don't align with its positions. It just writes checks and builds ports and roads and power plants. And guess what? When the United States shows up and says, "Cooperate with our demands, or we'll cut your aid and sanction your economy," and China shows up and says, "We'd like to invest billions in your infrastructure with no strings attached," which option do you think governments are going to choose? We're literally pushing countries into Beijing's arms. Russia is playing a similar game, offering military cooperation, energy deals, and political support to governments that feel alienated by Washington. This is strategic malpractice on a scale that's hard to overstate. We're taking a region that should be a natural sphere of American influence, where we have geographic proximity, deep economic ties, and shared cultural connections, and we're systematically destroying that influence through our own actions. Third, there are real economic consequences here that are going to hit American businesses and American workers. Latin America is a massive market for U.S. exports. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade. American companies have extensive operations throughout the region. Supply chains for everything from automotive manufacturing to agriculture to technology run through Latin American countries. And when you start threatening governments, when you create diplomatic instability, when you raise the possibility of sanctions and trade restrictions, you're putting all of that at risk. Business leaders are already expressing concern. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been quietly lobbying the administration to pull back from this approach because they understand that diplomatic conflict translates into economic uncertainty, which translates into lost contracts, reduced investment, and ultimately American job losses. And here's the kicker. A lot of the countries being warned are critical partners in managing issues that directly affect American security and prosperity. We're talking about counter-narcotics cooperation, migration management, intelligence sharing on transnational crime. You start treating these countries like adversaries, and that cooperation evaporates. Fourth, this has profound implications for immigration policy, which is supposedly one of Trump's top priorities. The administration's entire approach to immigration is based on the idea that you can externalize border enforcement by making other countries do the work. You process asylum seekers in Mexico and Central America. You conduct deportations to countries of origin. You dismantle migration routes before people reach the U.S. border. But all of that requires cooperation from Latin American governments. And cooperation is exactly what you're not going to get when you're simultaneously threatening those same governments. Countries that feel bullied and disrespected are not going to be eager partners in implementing policies that are deeply unpopular with their own populations. We've already seen this dynamic play out. When Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs during his first term, he eventually got some cooperation on migration. But it was grudging, minimal, and constantly subject to renegotiation. Now he's scaling that approach up to the entire hemisphere, and the likely result is that countries will give lip service to cooperation while doing as little as possible, or they'll actively resist in ways that make border enforcement more difficult, not less. Fifth, there's a humanitarian dimension here that's getting completely lost in the political and strategic analysis. We're talking about countries where millions of people live in poverty, where violence and instability are daily realities, where governments struggle to provide basic services. And the United States, which has historically positioned itself as a partner in development and a supporter of democracy and human rights, is now threatening to cut aid and impose sanctions if these countries don't comply with demands that often have nothing to do with their own interests or their own population's needs. There are real people whose lives are going to be affected by this. Humanitarian programs that provide healthcare, education, disaster relief are at risk. Development projects that create jobs and reduce the desperation that drives migration are being threatened. And the message being sent to ordinary people throughout the region is that America doesn't care about their welfare, only about its own narrow political agenda. That's the kind of message that echoes for generations and fundamentally damages America's image and influence. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because this situation is far from resolved. In the immediate term, we're going to see how Latin American governments respond to these expanded warnings. There's already been some pushback. Several countries have summoned U.S. ambassadors for formal consultations. There are reports of coordination among left-leaning governments to develop a united response. The Organization of American States is being pressured to address what some member states are calling unilateral American aggression. And behind the scenes, diplomatic channels are working overtime to try to de-escalate before things spiral completely out of control. But here's the problem. Trump has painted himself into a corner. He's made these threats public. He's staked his reputation and his political brand on being tough with Latin America. And that makes it very difficult to back down without looking weak. So we could be heading toward a scenario where the administration has to follow through on its threats, which would mean real diplomatic breaks, real economic consequences, and real damage to U.S. interests in the region. In the medium term, this is going to play out through the 2026 midterms. Democrats are going to make this a major campaign issue in districts with significant Latino populations. You're going to see ads highlighting Trump's threats against Latin American countries. You're going to see community organizing around the message that the administration disrespects the heritage and connections of Latino Americans. And you're going to see whether voters care enough about foreign policy to make it a factor in their electoral decisions. Historically, foreign policy doesn't drive elections unless it's directly connected to visible domestic impacts, like gas prices or casualties. But when you're talking about a demographic that has direct personal and familial ties to the countries being threatened, that calculation might be different. Republicans are going to have to decide whether they're comfortable defending this approach or whether they're going to try to distance themselves from it. And in tight races, that could make the difference. In the longer term, we're looking at a fundamental reshaping of hemispheric relations that could last for decades. Every threat the United States makes, every ultimatum that's issued, every instance of perceived bullying or disrespect, creates resentment that doesn't disappear when administrations change. We're building a legacy of mistrust that the next president, whoever that is going to have to spend years trying to repair. We're opening doors for rival powers that are going to be very difficult to close. We're creating economic dependencies on China and other actors that will reduce American leverage. And we're damaging the soft power and moral authority that have traditionally been among America's greatest strategic assets. All of this to pursue a hardline approach that expert after expert has said is counterproductive to achieving the administration's stated goals. And here's what nobody in the administration seems to want to talk about. There are alternative approaches that could actually work. You could engage with Latin American countries as partners rather than subordinates. You could address the root causes of migration through development assistance and support for governance. You could build coalitions around shared interests in combating transnational crime and promoting economic growth. You could leverage America's economic and technological advantages to create genuine win-win relationships. But all of that requires patience, diplomatic skill, and a willingness to treat other countries with respect. It requires recognizing that the United States, despite its power, can't simply dictate terms to sovereign nations without consequences. And it requires a long-term strategic vision that looks beyond the next news cycle or the next political campaign. None of that seems to be part of Trump's playbook. His approach is fundamentally about dominance, about making examples, about demonstrating toughness for domestic political consumption. And the cost of that approach is being paid in American influence, American security, and American prosperity. So here's the bottom line. The Trump administration's expansion of warnings to more Latin American nations represents a massive escalation in hemispheric relations that carries enormous risks and very limited upside. We're watching a foreign policy approach that's rooted in coercion rather than cooperation, that's creating opportunities for America's rivals, that's damaging critical economic relationships, and that's generating political backlash at home just months before crucial midterm elections. This isn't strategic thinking. This is reactive short-term political theater that's being conducted at the expense of long-term American interests. And the consequences are going to extend far beyond Trump's presidency. We're talking about relationships that take decades to build and moments to destroy. We're talking about strategic positioning in a region that's going to be increasingly important, economically and geopolitically. And we're talking about America's reputation as a reliable partner and a force for stability in the world. All of that is being risked for an approach that has consistently failed every time it's been tried throughout the history of U.S.-Latin American relations. Keep your eyes on this story because it's going to define American foreign policy in the hemisphere for years to come. Watch how Latin American governments respond. Watch whether the administration follows through on its threats. Watch what happens in the midterms. And watch whether anyone in Washington has the courage to stand up and say that this approach is fundamentally wrong. This is a story that's just beginning, and the ending could reshape the entire Western Hemisphere's geopolitical landscape. This could define not just the next few months, but the next decade of American power and influence in its own backyard. And right now, we're watching it unfold in real time.